Over the past few weeks, a new virus emerged in China, in Wuhan, a coronavirus.
We started analyzing the sequence of that virus in the evening of January 10th. And by Monday, January 13th, we had designed potential candidate antigens to be used in the vaccine.
We have just selected our lead candidate. We did extensive testing of our different candidate vaccines.
There's something about this disease that is not only different, it is pernicious.
Everything about this pandemic is unprecedented, including this amazing work that is going on with science, with manufacturing, with this kind of collaboration.
In the state of Connecticut, death rates per 100,000 of blacks versus whites are twice as high for blacks and whites.
African Americans do not have the kind of access to health that is needed to be able to give them, a fighting chance.
Get extremely aggressive about bringing the virus levels down, and then you probably can have a shot at opening up schools safely.
We hit 70,000 new cases today, 60,000 last week, 50,000 the week before. You know where this is going.
We are preparing huge-scale clinical trials to go as fast as possible.
The mortality rate continues to plummet because we're doing a much better job at identifying who the at-risk people are.
We really need a bulk of Americans to take the COVID-19 vaccine in order to provide immunity and to get through this.
I have to remain hopeful that if we stick to science, we will get through this sooner and stronger. And we are back. So much has happened in the month since our last show, but it seems that we are heeding the science more than ever. And hopefully that will allow us to finally turn the corner in this pandemic. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Ling, and welcome to season 3 of The Road to a Vaccine, an exploration of the COVID-19 crisis and the global community's efforts to develop a vaccine against the disease. This is a historic time and perhaps one of our most important broadcasts. It's been a year since the global coronavirus pandemic began, and we followed the road from the beginning. The virus is still wreaking a lot of havoc in the world, and new variants are proving to be highly infectious. Experts are predicting that they will drive numbers up again. But thankfully, we are living in an age of medical solutions. In less than a year, multiple vaccines have come available, and 3 more from Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and Novavax recently released their interim phase 3 results. These vaccines are based on different platforms than the mRNA vaccines. Now, the objective of this series is to try to educate. So today we're going to dive more deeply into what the study results really mean. We have an incredible lineup of guests who can do just that. First, we'll talk to J&J's Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Paul Stoffels. Then Dr. Uché Blackstock, founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity, will discuss equitable access to vaccines. And we'll have a joint conversation with Dr. Dan Barouch from the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and Dr. Matai Mammon, Global Head of R&D at Janssen, for a closer look at specifics on the J&J vaccine and the design of their clinical trials. But first, here's a look at where the global battle against this disease is today. We have reached over 103 million global cases and 2.2 million deaths around the world. As Bloomberg reported yesterday, over 98 million people have received vaccine doses globally. And just today, that number has increased to 101 million. Now that sounds like a lot, but we have a global population of 7 billion. So there's still so much work left to be done. And while the availability of multiple vaccines is a light at the end of the tunnel, we are conscious that we still have a long road ahead. Since we last saw you back in December, another 1.4 million people around the world have died from COVID-19. Our hearts go out to everyone who has experienced the loss of a loved one due to the virus. Now on Friday, Johnson & Johnson announced the interim results of their phase 3 clinical trials. And there's been a lot of discussion and plenty of questions about what this data means. There's no better person to answer these questions than our first guest, J&J's Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Paul Stoffels. He couldn't be here live, so I caught up with him earlier this morning to talk about some of the questions that have been coming up. Dr. Stoffels, it's so nice to have you back on the show. So much has happened in the month since we last spoke. Now, this past Friday, J&J made a major announcement about its phase 3 vaccine candidate. Can you share the news for our audience here and explain what the efficacy percentages mean? Because we've heard a range of numbers from 66% to 85% efficacious.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you for having me on the show, and very happy to tell a little bit about the results. But also, first of all, very happy to tell that we're very happy with the results. What we have seen is that we run a 45,000 people study across the US, Latin America, and South Africa. And we are in a completely different environment now, where there is a huge surge in the world. You have seen it in the US yourself, but also in Latin America, South Africa, you see a massive number of infections. But also at the same time, you see different strains circulating. And that is in Brazil, that's South Africa. Also, everyone knows about the UK strain. So that was a different environment. And if you look at when the moderate to severe endpoints, which are the most serious parts of the disease, then we learned that overall we had a 66% efficacy post day 28. When we look in the US for the same endpoints, we saw 72%. But then very important, when we analyze the severe endpoints, and the severe endpoints are hospitalization, very serious medical intervention, as well as death. And then we see an overall efficacy of 85% post day 28, as well as no hospitalizations and no deaths anymore 28 days after a single vaccination. And I think that's a very remarkable result. There's no difference according to age, no difference according to region, and even no difference according to strain, meaning that in South Africa, in the current circumstances, we have a very high efficacy on the severe endpoint, and with that preventing death and hospitalization.
So after 28 days, those in the trial had pretty full protection.
Yes, correct. Since we work with a single dose, the immune system needs to mature. And what we see is increasing immune response, even up to day 50, and now stable for a long time in the study. So that is what you have to expect from a vaccine. It takes some time before it works.
Speaking of the single dose, I know you were quoted as saying that a one-shot vaccine is considered by the World Health Organization to be the best option for fighting pandemics. Why will a single dose vaccine be so helpful in fighting a crisis like this?
Well, first, a single dose, if you administer once, it's very simple for people. You come once and you're protected. Yeah. For a booster dose, you have to come back. So if you need to vaccinate 6 billion people in the world, you need to see them twice. And that's a huge exercise. But moreover, a vaccine is very stable at 2 to 8 Celsius for at least 3 months. And that gives the ability to distribute it to the normal distribution challenges. So single dose, simple to distribute, 2 to 8 Celsius, but also very safe. What we also saw that we had a very good profile on fever, local reactions, and so almost no differentiation from placebo of any kind. And that gives us very comfort that we can do this fast. One more point, we had no anaphylactic shock, meaning that people probably, if after the first 1,000 observations, they can just come and go for their vaccination. We don't need any additional supervision for that. And I think that's going to be the very practical approach to vaccinate a very large number of people to protect them against disease, hospitalization, and death.
Dr. Stoffels, I know that some of the approved vaccines already have to be frozen, and the J&J vaccine just requires standard refrigeration. So how will that benefit in terms of global distribution?
Well, as you can understand, if you can distribute normally refrigerated at 2 to 8 Celsius, that allows to use the normal vaccine distribution systems which exist. And it allows to be vaccinated in a pharmacy, in every healthcare center without very complicated matters. So that is where this will be single dose, simple to distribute, and very safe to use. And that will allow fast vaccination and very broad and good protection against disease, or hospitalization, and death. And that will facilitate the rollout massively over the world, especially in countries where there is no infrastructure to go and have frozen vaccines sent around in the country. And that is where I think the vaccine will be very, very useful on a global basis.
And Dr. Stoffels, we've been hearing nonstop about the new variants of the COVID-19 virus, many of which are very highly transmissible. How concerned are you about this? And do you think the scientific community will need to rethink its vaccine strategy as a result?
Well, that thinking is ongoing as we speak. We observed in our study, in 6,000 people, in a 6,000 people study, all the cases, 90% were the South African variant. And that's strain to COVID very quickly because it is more transmissible, but also very pathogenic. And so that's why it starts of real concern. Now we call it the South African variant, but most likely these variants will emerge all over the world because that's a logic evolution when there is a viral replication ongoing. Viruses evolves, and with that new variants emerge, and it's very well possible that in different parts of the world these variants will emerge independently and not come from South Africa, but just emerge in Europe, in the US, and everywhere in the world because of the amount of replication ongoing.
And so do you think that we'll need to rethink vaccine strategy because of this?
Yes, we'll need to, well, what we showed is that with a single dose, combining a good antibody immunity, but also cellular immunity, we could cover a very high percentage of them. And that's what we learned. Now we have to stay very vigilant because new strains will emerge again and again, and we will have to adapt if needed a vaccine strain. We probably will add another vaccine for new strains if they really become very serious.
That's why people need to get vaccinated as quickly as possible because, as you said, these new variants are continuing to emerge. So big picture, what is the next step for you all? When will you submit for emergency use authorization? And assuming you get the approval, when will distribution of your vaccine begin?
We know this data since Thursday, Friday last week. The teams have worked relentless over the weekend and are preparing the files. Before the end of the week, we'll submit in the US. Soon after, we'll submit in Europe and in other parts of the world. And so then it takes its time with the regulators, and it's going to go very fast. But still, I think the month of February will be dedicated to review, and hopefully somewhere late February, early March or mid-March, a vaccine can be available. Of course, pending approval of an emergency use application in the US and a conditional approval in Europe, as it's called.
You know, Dr. Stoffels, it's incredible that we are here talking about this today because we spoke 10, 11 months ago, and we earlier showed this clip of you speaking about this contagious new virus that emerged from China. You first heard about it when you were in Davos and your team quickly mobilized to fight it. And now, only a year later, to have a safe and effective vaccine just seems so miraculous. So can you paint a picture for us about the unprecedented global collaboration from people at every level to get to where we are today?
Yeah, it was remarkable. It's exactly 12 months ago, actually, almost on the day that we declared that we were going to kick it off. And so it was a remarkable collaboration. First, within a company, normally you do a lot of things sequentially. This time, we did everything in parallel. We started the basic research, the upscaling, and preparing for clinical trials in parallel to get ready for the moment we needed it. And so that's why we were able to do this in 12 months, including a study of 45,000 people. We recruited at certain points up to 3,000 people a day into the study. Amazing, in 200 centers across the world, North America, Latin America, South Africa. And that's an enormous collaboration between academic centers, hospitals, clinical trial collaborators, the governments, the regulators. We had feedback from regulators within hours. Yeah, so if we need something, everyone was there on the spot all the time to make sure we could get this done. And it's clear that big corporations are people, governments are people, clinicians and nurses are people, and it were all these people They worked together to make this happen because they saw that then we see the challenge in the world and everyone's so committed that 24/7, hour by hour, everything was planned over the year to get to this result today, and hopefully in March or late February with approval and being able to start vaccinating people, protecting them against the disease. It was such an incredible experience to see that happen. And honestly, you don't have to manage that. It goes automatically. People work together, drive this through the organization, through the regulators, government people. The collaboration was hand in glove all the time. And I must say thank you. And also a big thank you to all the people who participated in the studies, because they gave their body to test placebo active comparison in order to learn about it. So it was an exciting experience, but it's not over. We need to continue this effort for a long time before the pandemic will be finished.
Dr. Stoffels, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know there still is a lot of work to do, but congratulations on these early numbers.
My pleasure. Thank you, Lisa.
And that was J&J's Dr. Paul Stoffels answering some of the questions that so many have been asking. You're watching The Road to a Vaccine, and we are live. Remember, if you have questions, put them in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Our next guest joined us last November, and she's someone I could talk to for hours, so I'm thrilled to have her back today. Dr. Uché Blackstock is an ER physician and founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity, and has been treating COVID patients for over a year now. She's been a fierce advocate for equitable outcomes in healthcare, and she's here with us today. Welcome back, Dr. Blackstock. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, I saw on your Twitter, and I'm an avid follower of yours, that you recently received a COVID-19 vaccination. So as a healthcare worker who's been on the front lines of this crisis, how does it feel to know that vaccines are finally arriving to help fight this disease?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be back. Well, I will say that receiving the vaccine was an incredibly emotional experience for me. I'm based in New York City, where we were the epicenter last spring, and I saw many COVID patients. I saw suffering that I never want to see in my patients. And the vaccine really has offered us so much hope. And I am very public about the fact that I've received a vaccine because of concerns about the vaccine by the public. And I want to make sure that I can serve as a role model to my patients and to other healthcare professionals also, as well as the rest of the public, that vaccines are safe and effective, and they're our exit out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I have spoken to quite a number of healthcare workers who've been on the front lines, and they just said that they became so emotional when they finally were able to receive the vaccine, just because it's just been such a grueling and harrowing year. I read the Washington Post piece that you penned with your twin sister yesterday. She's also a brilliant physician and activist, Dr. Uché Blackstock, about the gross inequities when it comes to access to healthcare and with the vaccines, even though the Black community here in America has been so disproportionately affected by COVID. So can you talk about what's happening with this vaccine rollout as it relates to people of color?
Sure. What we've seen so far, and part of the problem is that the data is not complete. We have only about 23 states reporting on racial and ethnic demographic data, but the trend that we're seeing thus far is incredibly concerning. We're seeing white Americans being vaccinated at almost 3 times the rate in some states as Black Americans, when, as you mentioned, we have a lot of data showing that Black communities have been disproportionately impacted by this virus. And so, we penned this op-ed just really to talk about what are some strategies that the Biden-Harris administration can use to make sure that we target these communities. And I know often these issues, excuse me, of vaccine hesitancy are often brought up, but I think what we really need is a transparent process that's equitable for getting the vaccines out to the communities that need them most. And what that looks like is a targeted outreach at a community level by community health workers or community-based organizations, but also making sure that the vaccines are accessible. So not only in hospitals and pharmacies, but schools and community centers. And then finally, we really need to make sure that we are mandating that the states report the complete data, because if we don't have the complete data, we don't have the complete picture of who's being most impacted.
Dr. Blackstock, in that article, you said that there are people from different communities who are coming into communities of color to get their vaccines. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've actually seen this across the country. We're seeing residents, usually white and more from affluent areas, coming into lower income Black communities and other communities of color accessing the vaccine. And even here in New York City, we have people that don't live in New York City who are non-residents, but maybe work in the city, but they've come into the city and are being vaccinated at many times the rate as residents of color. And so this is obviously very concerning. And I think that when you're looking at any process, right, and this is, for example, the vaccine rollout process, we really have to be intentional about ensuring that there is not inequity. And so what that looks like is thinking ahead and saying, how can we prevent the communities that are already impacted from being even more impacted? And so I think, for example, with the zip codes, we can think about ensuring that people who live in the zip codes that have been hardest hit receive first priority for those zip codes. Not to say that other people can't come in, but that people in the community, if they want the vaccine, they should get it and be prioritized.
Absolutely. These are the communities that are and have been this year the most vulnerable to this disease. We now have several vaccines approved and several more hopefully right around the corner. When we talk about the long history of distrust and even exploitation in communities of color, how would you advise these institutions to communicate better about the vaccine? And what do you think vaccine hesitant people need to know that's not currently being communicated?
No, that's such a great question. And I actually like to frame the issue of vaccine hesitancies more as institutional trustworthiness. How can healthcare institutions prove themselves more trustworthy? And I think what that looks like is ensuring that we're putting resources in the communities. So not only making sure that we have different points of access that are accessible to people to get the vaccine, but that we have people in those communities, healthcare professionals, community health workers, being able to give out information in a way that's culturally responsive and easily digestible. Many people have concerns that these vaccines were made very quickly. And while we know differently that this research has been going on for quite some time and that we were able to put the resources in, there are many concerns that I think are incredibly justified. But I think some of those concerns and fears can be allayed by an expansive public health messaging campaign that is nuanced to address the concerns of different communities, because we know the concerns of some Black communities may be different than the concerns of some Latinx communities, right? Just based on the issues that are pertinent. So I do think that there needs to be a concerted effort, but transparency is important. Transparency in the process, transparency in terms of getting information out there, but also a long-term commitment to these communities that have been disinvested in for such a long time.
Dr. Blackstock, we have some questions coming in from people who are watching right now. Mitzi from Facebook asks, how will the efficiency of all vaccines differ in different ethnicities?
And so actually, I think what we've seen so far, and I think that a lot of the vaccine manufacturers at some point in the development process really understood the importance of having a diverse clinical pool of clinical trial participants, that we haven't really seen any differences in outcomes based on race, that this vaccine is safe and effective for people regardless of race. And that's why we also need to ensure that we have diversity in clinical trials so that we can make this point that for these vaccines, really, they're safe for everyone, regardless of race.
I have a question from Priya from LinkedIn who asks, how are you planning to collect real-world data for the vaccine to generate robust evidence generation and to support confidence and understand better any differences in efficacy between ethnic groups?
Well, I think that I know the CDC has, they have a reporting form to ensure that if people are having any adverse effects, that data is collected, but also, excuse me, vaccine manufacturers are also still following these trial participants to ensure that there aren't any other adverse effects. But we know mostly with vaccines that most of any side effects are usually pretty acute, occurring within a day or two of receiving the vaccine. And so overall, there's less concern about long-term effects, but I'm sure they're monitoring for them.
I have one more question from Jeanette from Facebook, who asks, access to appointments is incredibly challenging. Is there a way to ensure equity in appointments for qualified groups and minorities?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And what we're seeing across the country is people on hold for a very long amount of time or on websites that are crashing. And so I know that here in New York City, one idea that's been brought up is having vaccine navigators. So people who are trained to help people sign up for these appointments and to navigate the registration process. It's much, much needed. We also need ways that are not based on computer or smartphones to register for appointments as well to make them more accessible. But again, these are the strategies that we need to start thinking about in terms of ensuring an equitable process.
Dr. Blackstock, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your advocacy. We'd love to have you on again, and maybe you can bring your sister back as well.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Would love to. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Uché Blackstock. Now, for all of you watching, if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section. And as I said, we'll do our best to get them answered. Next up, we have two guests joining us, Dr. Dan Barouch, Director for the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and Dr. Mathai Mammon, Global Head of R&D for Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies. Now, these are the two key scientists leading the teams that developed the Janssen investigational vaccine. Their collaboration across continents has been unprecedented, and it's my pleasure to welcome them both back to the show to give us their perspective on this major development. Doctors Barouch and Mammon, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have both of you back on the show. I've talked to you at various points throughout this journey. And now that this first interim data from the phase 3 study has been analyzed and will be submitted to the FDA and other health authorities for their rigorous review, I just have to ask you how it feels to have been on the front lines leading these teams that have been working on this promising COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Barouch?
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here again today. And we are incredibly excited about the results that were announced last Friday. It feels amazing to have worked so hard over the last year on this project and to see protection in humans at such a high level that speaks to the potential of this vaccine saving countless lives. For us, it's always been an obligation to do whatever we can to try to help this pandemic and to help find a solution to this pandemic. And we were so fortunate to start collaborating with a group at J&J starting in January of last year, and then to have this journey together through science, through experiments, through clinical trials to the point we are today. But it's an overwhelming, amazing feeling. But we still have so much more work to do. So we can't rest for very long.
Dr. Barouch, we aired a clip in the beginning of the show in which you talked about getting the sequence for the virus about a week after, or immediately after China released it, but you just jumped into action and started working on the vaccine. Did you think that just a year later you would have these kinds of results?
Well, we started working on this project on January 10th of last year, the day that the Chinese researchers released the sequence of the virus. On that day, there were news reports that a mysterious pneumonia had spread to 41 cases in Wuhan and one person had died. And we found those numbers to be truly alarming. And now, a year later, we've moved from 41 cases to over 100 million cases and one death to over 2 million deaths. We would have never predicted that this virus could do what it has done.
And Dr. Mammon, tell me about how you're feeling after the results of this this trial has been.
I appreciate being back on, Lisa. Thank you very much. How do we feel? So it's hard to put it into a very short sentence. It's been a long journey, that we were saying internally began probably a decade ago through certain decisions to bring in a platform that even positioned us to be able to dream of doing what we're doing right now. And that is work on an Ad26 based vaccine in a manner that the intrinsic nature of it and the cell line in which we grow it allow it to be grown at scale and induce the right kind of immune response when injecting it into a person. So that predates the program itself, of course. And then the work over the last 12 months, as Dan Barouch just said, as our key collaborator, and Paul Stoffels said before me, it's been a journey of incredible energy, doing many things differently than we've done in the past. As Paul said, we've operated much more in parallel. We've taken huge risks to manufacture, to optimize. Before we even had biological data preclinically, we were already optimizing manufacturing. So these are not things that are typically done at a company. There's a group of people both at the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital under Dan and at Janssen that are extraordinarily committed. So you get a lot of energy and a lot of adrenaline and a lot of creativity over the last 12 months. So when we first learned of the data, there's a kind of a relief that's hard to describe. Then that's quickly followed by a feeling of elation, joy, these feelings that come soon after relief. And so right now, the goal of that same team is to rigorously put together all the data so that the regulators, who are ultimately the arbiters of deciding both efficacy and safety, can themselves independently weigh in on everything that we're right now, excited about. So those are the feelings.
It's incredible. Now J&J's investigational vaccine is currently a single dose. So can you talk about why you decided to focus on a single dose, and will you continue to research a 2-dose option as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So we spent time. So Dan and Johan van Hoof and Hanneke Schumacher, their teams spent time. This distinguishes us from the approaches that others took, and I'm glad that everyone took different approaches here, which is good. But we spent time making a large number of candidates for vaccines that are different in important but subtle ways, and picking the very best one that would induce the strongest possible antibody and T-cell response. That was what we did. And what happened with that is that we had such a good antigen that we put into our vaccine that was able to draw a sufficiently large immune response that we gained confidence we could actually go in with 1 dose. We don't necessarily need the second dose. Dan's lab produced key data that made our conviction even stronger, like this is going to work. Then we saw phase 1 data in humans, and again, this is probably going to work. So at that point, we kicked off a very large study. We picked a particular dose of the 1 dose, and we picked 2 of those doses and kicked off a 2-dose study, stagger starting it, but that's ongoing. So we're halfway done right now. So that is the basis. It's that optimization that our team and Dan's team did together that I think yielded the kind of vaccine where 1 dose would be sufficient.
And will you continue to research a 2-dose option?
We will. I think that we're feeling pretty good about our data from the 1 dose, as we can talk about. But we're scientifically rigorous. We're a very thorough company, and I think it's proper to study a 2-dose or a boosted regimen. The data that we have would suggest that it could be even better. It could lead to even more durability, and we'll explore whether that's true or not as we continue the study. That's a 30,000 person study run globally in multiple continents, and we're about 15,000 people into that study.
Dr. Barouch, I have to ask a safety question because there are many who are concerned about how fast these vaccines have been produced. And it's not like you started from scratch with this vaccine. Can you talk about how the platform has been used and tested for other viruses previously?
Sure, absolutely. Safety is the most important feature of any vaccine, because a vaccine that's highly effective, but if it's not safe and trusted by the public, then it won't be used and it will fail in its mission to stop the pandemic. So safety is absolutely important for a vaccine. The Ad26 platform started, as Matai described, many years ago, actually as part of our HIV vaccine program that started in approximately 2004. And the first clinical trial started in 2007. So there are actually some people who have received Ad26-based vaccines for other pathogens, of course, but still the platform for over a decade now. And over the last several years, J&J has advanced Ad26-based vaccines for multiple different pathogens, including Zika, Ebola, RSV, and others. And so even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been over 100,000 people throughout the world who have received Ad26 vaccines, and it has proven safe and immunogenic in those large numbers of people. But what's most important for this vaccine, of course, is the safety of the actual COVID-19 vaccine itself. And with the study results that were just released last week, showing really outstanding safety and tolerability in a large study of 45,000 individuals. That's actually a lot of person years of experience. And so the safety database for the COVID-19 vaccine itself is actually very, very strong. But on top of that is safety for more than 10 years using this platform for other pathogens.
Yeah, Dr. Stoffels earlier in the show just talked about how there were no cases of anaphylaxis. Which is pretty remarkable with a study that large. Dr. Mammon, I think it's really interesting also that your investigation was done all over the world, but in places like South Africa at a time when these new mutations were emerging and starting to spread. So can you talk about the design of this clinical trial? And in some ways, Dr. Stoffels mentioned that in a population of 6,000 in South Africa, 90% had that mutation. So yeah, tell us about the design of the trial.
Sure. No, it's a really good question. We're a global company, and so the entire planet was at our disposal in a sense, and we wanted to be agnostic. We used a very rigorous analytical methodology conducted by our data science group in conjunction with a group at MIT to basically model the pandemic, and use these machine learning methods to say, if we could go anywhere on the planet, what spots would we put clinical trial sites? So that was the method we used, and we placed them at places we believe that the incidence would be sufficiently high as to be able to gather the data as quickly as possible. And so that was our basis, and that led us to be in multiple parts of the world. There was emphasis on South Africa and multiple countries in South America, Latin America, and the United States, because that's where we saw the pandemic as being particularly problematic. And we've been proven correct on that. These are exactly the spots where, unfortunately, there's been very high incidence, and exactly around the sites where we believed. Now, we couldn't have predicted necessarily that there are particular variants in particular spots, but because of our choices to be so international and where the incidence is high, and that the chance of getting a mutant of some sort, a variant of some sort, is proportional to the number of replications. So if you go where the incidence is particularly high, then it makes it more likely that variants will emerge. And what we've found then is we've just produced a data set that is highly relevant for the planet, because it captures all these different variants. And that will turn out to be one of the key highlights of the data set that we're submitting to FDA and other regulators.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, you couldn't have predicted that this variant would have emerged in South Africa, but in some ways, was it a benefit to have been able to have your vaccine exposed to it there?
There's no question. There's no question. I've been asked in the last couple of days, like, do we wish we were just here or here? No, of course not. Like, because we picked high incidence areas, we then were putting ourselves where we're most likely to see these variants emerge, and they emerge. And the variants that people are talking about, like the South Africa variant, or the P1, P2 variants in Brazil, or the UK variants, the various forms of this virus, those are what's relevant to, those variants are relevant to people today. So if we had not, we wouldn't have as relevant information today.
I'll just add, that the demonstration of efficacy against these variants is absolutely critical. So showing clinical efficacy in areas like Brazil and South Africa with more than 95% of a partially antibody-resistant variant is incredibly important for the clinical rollout of this vaccine, because we know those variants are already circulating in the United States, probably at higher levels than what we realize. And the expectation is that will grow substantially over time. So it's really important for vaccines to show clinical efficacy against the most resistant, the most contagious, the most concerning viral variants in the world. And through the amazing matching of sites with areas of surges and variants, then this data set achieves that.
And actually, can I add one thing to Dan's
Yeah,
commentary?
absolutely.
Very specifically, what we were able to see is a lot of cases in South Africa, as Dan said, predominantly almost more than 90% due to this variant. And we saw there too 85% protection against severe COVID and complete protection against going to the hospital or worse, or dying. And that's a remarkable result.
Well, that is remarkable, just given how fast these mutations are spreading. I mean, they're already present here in the United States. I want to ask a couple of questions that we've been getting from viewers. Daryl from LinkedIn asks, will vaccination become an ongoing process and yearly process with the emergence of new strains popping up globally? Either one of you want to take that?
Sure, I can take a first go at that. So thank you for the question. At this point, I think it's not clear. The emergence of these variants, it was long predicted and expected, but the rapidity of the emergence of multiple variants over the last 2 months, I think, has been very worrisome, and certainly leads to the concern that there might be additional variants that emerge next month or the month after. That reinforces the importance of getting this pandemic under control, both through public health measures such as social distancing and mask wearing, but also through acceleration of the vaccine campaign nationally and globally. And I think having a third vaccine rolled out in the US and throughout the world, and hopefully additional vaccines in the springtime, is absolutely critical for having the most rapid rollout of a vaccine campaign throughout the world as possible. And one of the reasons for that is because the faster we can get people vaccinated, the faster we can slow down and ideally stop the emergence of these new concerning viral variants. And the worry, well, we know now that the variant emerging in South Africa is susceptible to at least this vaccine, which is fantastic news. But what we don't know is whether there could be a variant that emerges next month that will be even more worrisome than the current ones. So it's really critically important to accelerate the vaccine campaign throughout the world as fast as we can. But specifically to answer the question, I think it's not yet clear. And to some extent, it depends on how quickly we can get the pandemic as it exists today under control. If we can get it under control relatively quickly, we might still have an opportunity to eliminate it. If we
That's right. The only way we can do that is for as many people as possible to get vaccinated. You know, here in the US, we talk about achieving herd immunity, but the entire world, we have to get to 70% vaccinated around the world in order to be able to achieve real herd immunity.
If we cannot get the pandemic under control in the near future, then it is very likely that in areas of the world, pockets that do not have the epidemic under control will continue to emerge viral variants that could then spread throughout the world, leading to essentially endless cycles of new variants, new vaccinations, and ongoing pandemic.
So companies like J&J and others, we're preparing for that possibility by working on next generation vaccines now. We began a month ago thinking about what might be needed, and at risk have begun work. But I'm with exactly, Lisa, what you said and Dan said, that the way to prevent that is to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible.
Dr. Mammon, we have a question from Hala from LinkedIn. Are you planning to collaborate with other pharmaceutical labs to produce global quantities of the J&J vaccine if approved?
So we're in conversation right now. This is, Paul Stoffels said this a moment ago, but one of the incredible silver linings about the entire pandemic is it's brought the world together in a way that I've never seen in my professional career. It's brought governments to companies, and it's brought companies together with other companies. And we've been part of an alliance of companies that have worked together. And another one that has been brought together by the U.S. government in Operation Warp Speed. I've never seen such collaboration at this level. So of course, we will be open to any assistance and assisting others as we go forward as needed. So those are conversations that are underway, and we can talk more definitively about that after, if FDA and other regulators judge this worthy of an emergency use authorization, then that becomes really relevant. But these conversations are happening behind the scenes.
In talking about the need for the world to become vaccinated, really, I talked to Dr. Stoffels about how the Janssen investigational vaccine can be stored in normal refrigerators. So can you elaborate on how that will aid the distribution process globally?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that one. So right now, when a vaccine, usually when it's centrally stored, you can tolerate all sorts of unusual storage conditions, including deep freeze, like minus 80 degrees, et cetera. But the moment it starts leaving there and going through normal shipping channels, trucking channels, and you arrive at the place where you need to use it, then the special features are increasingly rare, right? You can't access that kind of temperature as easily. Now, I'd say our colleagues at Pfizer have done a tremendously good job on making the supply chain compatible. But these are not easy things. And I do believe that our vaccine, which only needs to be stored in the refrigerator for months and potentially a lot longer than that, that will make it much easier. You can just go to a local drugstore or a local place that's very local, like close to your home, and be able to get a vaccine and not have to go through these, not go necessarily to a special place and line up for a long time.
Well, Drs. Barouch and Mammon, look, the road ahead is still a lengthy one, but kudos on these initial results. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lisa.
Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to explore more about the quest to distribute vaccines to people as quickly as possible. The developments in the COVID-19 vaccine space give me great hope that we are moving closer to the end of the pandemic. And as we embark upon this new year and redouble our efforts in the fight against COVID-19, I'm also hopeful that our children will one day look back at this moment in history and know that we served them well. Everyone can do their part, from scientists and laboratories to governments to individuals like you and me, sticking to guidelines and please wearing masks to protect our neighbors and those around us. Thank you to our guests for being here today and to all of you for watching. Join us in 2 weeks for the next installment of The Road to a Vaccine. And in the meantime, please keep posting your questions. And if you have any guests you'd like to see on the show, submit them as well. Thanks. We'll see you in a couple weeks.